Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today, this is the AAR on the debate between Brenton and Keith Preston on the best strategy forward for the abolishing the state according to anarchist principles. I'm also joined today by a fellow contributor to my live streams in other contexts, Anarcho-reign. This AAR is taking a little while to get together. It's hard getting the whole crew back, but we finally got it. And I think it was a very interesting debate. What it did show, and I think it achieved what it intended to, was how two, intelligent people representing their positions can have a civil dialogue. I think the main criticism that I would have is you kind of guys did agree too much. Now, it was a little more, okay, yeah, I agree with these basic principles, but it would have been nice to see a little more teasing out of the actual pros and cons of the strategies that each of you are advocating. So, for example, I think, Brenton, you gave a solid defense of classic anarchist direct action. And Keith gave a classic defense of his own, pan-anarchism of we can ally with certain other people that may not be as ideologically pure, but we have enough in common that we can bring down the state together. And what I would argue is I think that pan-anarchism and classical anarchism both have a sort of pan-anarchism, I think, is in some sense a natural extension of what we might call the Popular Front. So during the Spanish Civil War, all of the leftists who agreed on a core set of socialist values and liberal values united against Franco's forces of the nationalists. And what Keith is saying, well, if we look at anti-authoritarianism, which is a subset of anarchist thought, but not limited to anarchism, we can make common cause along that front. So it does seem to have a sort of genetic history, if you will, from the Popular Front. And it would have been nice to see a little more discussion over the pros and cons, especially from Brent's perspective, of why that may not be a bad idea, why it might be a good idea, or vice versa. But otherwise, I think you guys both gave a classic defense of your positions. It would have been nice to see a little more give and take on that. So I guess, looking at you, Keith, what would you say you think you did the best at communicating in the debate, and where you think, maybe looking back at it, you might have done a little better?
Well, it's really hard to say because I don't know, I don't necessarily perceive myself the way other people perceive me. The feedback that I got from people I showed that clip to were largely the same things you were saying. You were saying, well, people were saying, well, where do you and Brent actually disagree? You tended to focus more on things you agreed with. I had this one friend of mine who was, I guess he's kind of like a post-left anarchist. He's got some libertarian leanings, but he's also been an anarcho-communist and things like that. But he was saying that he was describing my view, and he was saying, well, the way I see he sees my view is, he says, you're basically a classical anarchist, but you bring it into this kind of pan umbrella, and then you throw on all these modern tweaks that are more contemporary. And I think that's a fairly accurate assessment of my views. I think that probably there would have been a more lively discussion if we had focused more, like you were saying, on things we might disagree with. I don't know that Brent and I would disagree on certain basic principles. I think that the direction we would take things in from there would probably be a lot different. For instance, I know during the debate at one point I raised a question of, well, what about the culture that's built up around the anarchist subculture, which I'm actually very critical of, the social justice warrior, whatever you want to call it, PC, Antifa, whatever culture I'm actually very critical of. I get the feeling from the things that he says or posts or whatever that he probably is far less critical of all that than I am. So that's actually an interesting question. And how does this relate to the wider anti-authoritarian paradigm? I think probably that would have made it more interesting for the viewers, at least, if they had seen all that. And there was really, we only had about an hour to do the conversation, so we couldn't touch on but so many things. But some of the other issues were things like, well, how viable are different strategies and anarchist tactics and all of that kind of thing. I've always thought that was an interesting question because, I've written a lot about anarchist strategy, but I don't consider my views to be the only legitimate point of view. I consider my views to be sort of well, okay, we can have my views, and then there's other people with other anarchist views and other anti-authoritarian views. They can have theirs as well. It's not that I think my view should have a monopoly or anything like that. But I think comparing different ideas of that type together might have been made it a little bit more interesting as well.
Yeah, exactly. Not to relitigate the debate, but like, for example, if maybe you guys had focused in on, are classical, like, Rothbardian libertarians useful allies from an anti-authoritarian perspective? Keith would argue, yeah, they're against the state. Brent might argue, well, no, because the capitalist system is undergirded by the state, and if they're still tied to the capitalist system, how valuable of an ally can they be? That's the kind of give and take that might have been more interesting to the viewership. Oh, so Brenton, what do you think was where you did best, and maybe where you could improve on your communication?
I think I did best primarily in, effectively describing past anarchist societies and kind of just going into the history of the movement. I think I could probably do a little bit better on two fronts. One, I would have liked to have gone a little more into depth on how I can see anarchism working today and my own ideas behind it. I pretty much just restated things that had already happened and people had already said. And I think that, at least for me, I think it's more important, to look and see where we're going forward. The other part, and I think this is my main debate takeaway is, and this goes back to a disagreement Keith and I actually recently had on his wall, like just this morning. And I kind of regret that he mentioned national anarchists, and that kind of slipped under my radar. Like I heard it and thought, oh, I should respond to that. But then it just kind of got skipped, and by the end I'd completely forgotten that it had even been brought up. So I do wish I'd pressed Keith a little harder on that, largely because I think in a lot of ways Keith and I are very similar in that we both tend to be fairly tolerant of differing views and lifestyles and perspectives. Though I think I may draw a harder line on certain issues than Keith does for more or less personal and symbolic purposes. I find that, for me personally, this goes beyond me being an anarchist. There are certain aspects that are vital to me, just so that I can look at myself in the mirror and consider myself a person of integrity. Not saying necessarily that everyone has to think exactly like me to have integrity, but sometimes when we're talking about ethics, when we're talking about politics, it is important for us to be able to say no. And if we don't say no to certain things, we can kind of lose, I guess, lose focus, or to put it in another way, you can kind of lose your soul. And I'm not accusing Keith of that. That's just, the metaphor that I chose. So yeah, I think I should have pressed harder on the national anarchist thing. I think also that we could have gotten a little bit more and focused more on where we disagree. The thing is, I think people watch debates kind of to see emotions fly, and they go in there and they want to see somebody get punked. And really, like, that's not exactly what I want to do, and I don't think that's what Keith or you want to do. Like, I recently did a debate with the distributist, thanks partially to Todd, and he had just come off a debate with Vaush, and Vaush really did the very entertaining thing of being a total jerk. But at the same time, how much was actually accomplished? Whereas I feel like the debate with the distributors, I think we both learned from each other, and I feel like that was much more constructive than what we've seen. So, I guess it's striking a balance between, finding points of contention and also, being entertaining. Because, sometimes people watch these things just to watch people get mad.
Unfortunately, that's true. So what are your thoughts, Anarcho, on the relative performances of Keith and Brenton?
Well, I think they both did a fairly decent job at getting to the paradigm disagreement between pan-anarchism and classical left anarchism, which really comes down to the definition of authoritarianism and subsequently anti-authoritarianism. Keith, as I understood from the debate, basically defined anti-authoritarianism in the decentralized sense of each person having, or like each community having the self-determination to decide the sort of lifestyle and community structure, whether it be white separatists, black separatists, capitalists, socialists, guildists, what have you. His definition of anti-authoritarianism was the ability to choose that without a central hierarchical structure preventing that. Whereas Brett was far more of a universalist in terms of like he wanted to abolish all authoritarianism on the local level as well. And I like that he brought up the example of, say, like an abusive parent, or someone who abuses another person on the individual level, like say an abusive spouse or abusive parent. And I think it's a good point because a slave master or a feudal serf could just as easily argue from the decentralist structure about their freedom to control their human property or their serfs the way they want, and their objection to a central authoritarian intervening on their affairs. And I think that's really the primary disagreement from what I've seen. From what I've seen of how traditional left anarchists have addressed both ANCAPs and also pan-anarchists, why they're not willing to. Well, it explains why they're more. I think they're why you see a lot more unity amongst libertarian socialists with authoritarian socialists, is because authoritarians and libertarians on the socialist sphere have a similar goal of a communist community with de-emphasized family structure and de-emphasized patriarchal structure, because they're more interested on like human individual relations, whereas pan-anarchy and even anarcho-capitalists are more interested on allowing each person the freedom to decide, how much, I guess, individual or personal authority they want to accept, whilst eschewing the more centralized bureaucratic forms of authority, is I think where the paradigm disagreement comes down to.
I think you're right, Anarcho. And I guess to extend the criticism to me as the host, I think one of the things that I could work on is asking a question that's more specific. So, for example, the way the debate was framed was, what's a better strategy to abolishing the state, pan-anarchism or classical, say, left anarchism or the Popular Front? That's a pretty broad topic. To get the kind of meat and potatoes we're talking about, I could have phrased it this way. Is it useful to ally with other anti-authoritarians, whether they be ethno-nationalist, a capitalist, a theocrats, in the broader anti-state struggle? That might have brought to the fore, from the terms of the debate, more of that underlying disagreement. So in the future, I could maybe work on asking for a more pointed question that does draw out that underlying disagreement that we want to see. I think you probably agree with that, right, Keith? Now you're muted, Keith. Sorry about that.
I haven't heard anything that's been said, so I can't really reply to any of that. But the audio, I'm not getting the audio from anyone but you, so I don't really know anything that's been said.
Oh, that's unfortunate. But I guess from just responding to me, though, maybe I could have asked a more pointed question, more specific, to draw out that underlying difference, because as it was fairly broad and gave you both a lot of room to cover other materials.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think maybe a somewhat more focused debate. I do think the question you just raised about, who gets counted as an anti-authoritarian in the first place, I think that probably would have been an interesting topic. There probably would have been some different views on that. Also, there's a lot of other contingent issues that circle the whole idea of the, what is the state in the first place, and what is the struggle against the state, and why do you oppose the state, all those kinds of things. So I think there's some wider philosophical and cultural and all of the economic and other issues that are contingent upon all of that. And I think that probably would have represented some more cleavages that would have been interesting.
Yeah, and I think you probably also as well agree, Brent, that something framed as I just stated it would have probably been more pointed and more direct to bring out this underlying disagreement.
Yeah, I definitely do think so. I think it would have been very interesting too, because that's one of the points I think where Keith and I have most of our disagreements. I actually think it might be better to have alliances with people who explicitly disagree with you than to necessarily share your goals of anti-authoritarianism. I mean, there's a lot of anti-authoritarians, anti-state people, particularly when you get into like sovereign citizens, and you get into certain, types of libertarianism. I think the kind of extreme example of this is the libertarian who wants to be free from the state so he can be a pedophile, that kind of thing. And once again, I'm not putting words in Keith's mouth here, but sometimes I find that the real politic of the situation, the kind of Game of Thrones approach, where you make alliances with people you despise, is not necessarily the right way to go about politics in general. I would rather make an alliance with a statist who has integrity than an anti-statist who I believe may share certain views with me for I guess the wrong reasons, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah, no, it does. What are your thoughts on this, Anarcho?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the last thing Brent just said. I think that's definitely something I've learned in my own. I used to be someone who would, especially back when I was a lot more sympathetic to the ANCAP movement, or whatever you want to call it. I would say, it doesn't. I don't care. I would ally with anyone who wants to overthrow the state, and then the communists can do their thing. Right libertarians can do their own thing. But I found that a lot of politics is personal. This is why the term identity politics thrown around. And I've come to believe that, all politics is, I used to believe in, even implicitly, the kind of Plato Aristotelian ideal that you could separate yourself from, you could have your private self, but then you have your public self who would deliberate on the issues in a very rationalistic manner. And at the end of the day, I find that people's personal identity is just ultimately going to play out in politics in ways that they might not even have be able to figure out. And I think that's why that's what caused a lot of my migration over to the traditionalist sphere, is that I just found that I could not disassociate my socially conservative views from my from what, I used to think that economics and political structures were the only important issues to debate, and social issues were a distraction. But now I've come to place a lot more importance on social issues, which in a way are a lot more I think they speak to your person in a way, and that's why, and I think that's why the personal and the political are very much interlinked and almost one and the same.
Okay, yeah. I think one other thing that would have been an interesting premise for disagreement is, on the one hand, I know Brenton would have had a very lively debate over whether these non-socialist anti-authoritarians could be useful allies. But I think also from another side, we might have also had a vibrant debate had we framed it. Are there certain principles within socialism that seem to move towards a authoritarian top-down enforcement mechanism in virtue of the outcomes they're trying to achieve. And I think that, from Keith's end, could have led to a lively debate with Brent. Maybe these could be possible future debates. But I think in general, though, these more specific concepts that we sort of you learn by doing, right? So you start with the debate, the topic might be too broad, and then you realize, oh, shoot, we didn't really cover what we wanted to cover. But that's part of the learning process, and then you can refine it through these kinds of discussions, and then hopefully with the next debate, you can maybe have a more pointed point of divergence. And sometimes debates lay the groundwork for future debates. So the debate that you guys already had might have laid the groundwork for the potential for future debates. So I'll begin with Keith again. What are some of your thoughts on those statements? You're muted again, Keith.
Perhaps a more narrowly defined topic would have been more appropriate. I think the original topic was pan-anarchism versus left anarchism. Both of those are pretty broad topics in and of themselves. I mean, there's a lot of different directions you can take those in. So if you want, I think, you know, it's interesting to think about, well, do you want to debate about things you're mostly going to agree on, or do you want to debate about things that you mostly are going to disagree on? I think that I see in the comments thread, Brent said something about national anarchism. Yeah, I think that discussing that probably would have led to a lot of disagreement, but it certainly would have made probably a more interesting, led to a more interesting discussion for the listener, I think. So that something like that is interesting. Also, I haven't, you know, again, I haven't heard until just a moment ago, I haven't heard much of what was said before. But one comment I just heard was the relationship between personal values and political values and things like that. I do think that that is something that separates me from both leftists and rightists, in the sense that I don't really see the personal being political. You know, I have all kinds of personal opinions about things, and I don't really expect people that I am associated with politically to agree with me on that. You know, I tend to look at it like I see the world more in terms of tribes. You know, like all of these different kinds of value systems and belief systems people have. They're just another tribe or another sect or another religion or another, you know, whatever. You know, you don't have to use the word tribe to use something else. And it's always going to be like that. You know, it's been like that since the dawn of history, as far as we know, and it's probably going to always be like that in the future, as far as we know. I mean, the particular value systems change, but that dichotomy between, there's always going to be people who disagree about something, even among anarchists. Like among all the different kinds of people who claim to be anarchists, you have about as many different ideologies as you do other ideologies put together. So even if everybody in the world said, okay, I'm an anarchist, you would still have infinite varieties of disagreements about all kinds of other things. You know, like I constantly hear stories about an anarchist event happening somewhere and somebody gets in a fist fight or vandalizes somebody else's bike or something over some political argument. You know, and that's among people who theoretically believe the same things or have similar views. And a lot of that kind of stuff is what shapes my own thinking, you know, the idea that the other will always be there, whatever the other is. And one thing that I have disagreed with a lot of left anarchists on, and some people from the right as well, is this idea that there can be a universal value system. I don't know that there really can be a universal value system. There can be differences of, you know, there can be a shared consensus about certain things, but there's always going to be a huge variation on the micro level. And that seems to often be where the conflict comes in. There seems to be more fighting between people many times who agree with each other on most things than there is between people who agree with each other on almost nothing. So exploring that a little bit further might be interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I guess before we move on to Brenton, do you think, Keith, that you would be interested in having a debate in the future on one of these more direct questions?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Cool. All right, go ahead. Brent, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, so first off, I would definitely be interested in having a debate in the future. I really enjoyed the last one, and I think we can get some good work done here because, you know, ideas spread. We do have an audience, and one of the things that's been very important to me in the time that I've been involved with activism and specifically the anarchist scene is I've always strove to have a good effect on the anarchist community around me. The more prominence I got, the more aware I became of the prominence, and as a result, more responsibility for me to, move things in a good direction. And I think we have the opportunity to do that here with these conversations. It's actually very interesting because the personal is political to a certain extent, but I thought Keith had a really good point with there is no escaping the other. This actually goes back to like Buddhist philosophy for me, and I'd highly recommend folks check out Alan Watts. He's got a ton of lectures on YouTube, and like the dude just blows my mind every time I hear him. It kind of like, I don't think I've ever actually heard a public intellectual like Alan Watts. So definitely check him out, especially if you're like into Zizek or Jordan Peterson or Chomsky. So because he's way better than all three. But the thing about self and other is that this dichotomy is something that you really honestly can't do without. It's the idea of like, you go into a room and you stack all the boxes on the top of the room, or you eliminate the bottom somehow. Buddhists call that dependent origination, and certain things cannot exist without their inverse in actual reality. A good example of this would be property as theft. In an objective sense, the act of making something property is objectively no different from the act of taking property that's already owned by someone else. The only difference is in your mind. So the concept, like theft could not exist without property, and property could not exist without theft. And that the same thing happens with people, self and other, hot and cold. Game of Thrones is ending tonight, ice and fire. they cannot exist independent of each other, no matter how much we can imagine that they might. So I think that is an interesting way to think about politics, especially like through identity politics, because I would say there is definitely a danger going too far into identity politics and looking like, I think this was described, one of the complaints with conservatives was, it's like you go to a restaurant, you say, I don't like eggs. I want that off the menu. No one should have eggs because I don't like eggs. But at the same time, politics is an expression of not just individual, but values of society, and people should fight for their values to be adopted to a certain extent. We need it to feel safe in our tribes, and also, we need it to feel like we have a degree of personal integrity. I think it's very important that people make the argument for a better, more sane world.
All right, Anarcho, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely agree with both what Keith and Brent just said about how we're never going to be able to convert all of humanity to our mode of thinking, and we could argue if that's even a desirable end state. But at the same time, I think there is a limit to what, and I guess this is kind of a critique of pan-anarchism, is I do believe at some point there will how we can simply divide ourselves into separate communities. And I look at this based on nation states, and now you can argue which is the operative reason for why there's conflicts between nation states. Is it the nation? Is it the state? Or is it both? And I think at some point, while states do have a natural inclination to expand their domain, to secure their power, and to declare war when they see it necessary to preserve the status quo, which is where I believe the word state derives from. I think also different nations and the different values they hold to, even nations formed purely of a certain people like the Bretons and the Franks, they all tend to the histories that defined those peoples and the cultures create a set of values that I do believe are fundamentally incongruous with other nations. And to some extent, there is a sense that we could say, okay, live and let live. This is how we do things in our and on our land. This is not something we can impose on everyone. But at the same time, I do believe, especially in the West, there is a sense of universalism, especially Christian universalism, which also adopted by the Enlightenment, that there is certain symbols of right to life and to a certain kind of liberty that ought to be enjoyed by all human beings. And I think other cultures, whether they're explicit about it or not, I think, for instance, Islamic cultures are very explicit about the fact that they believe Islam is that Allah rules the world, and that different cultures are an affront to their way of living. And it raises the question of to what extent can we adopt this live and let live attitude, where we say, okay, there are going to be different tribes, we can't the same set of values. We need to just allow these people to live and let live. And to what extent can we have that frame of mind? But then what can we say there are that have to be adopted, and maybe we don't necessarily need to impose them via some sort of imperialistic military conquest, but we should at least find other ways of imposing them, maybe through trade sanctions or denouncements, whatever peaceful means we have. For Israel, it would be boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Other means to either peacefully or, if necessary, violently impose what we believe are universal moral values.
Yeah. So I think at this point we've sort of covered the basic elements of last debate. I think what I really like to get out of these debates is having rigorous disagreements, but done in a polite, civil fashion, to sort of stand as a benchmark for other people to follow. And I think all of us here want to do that, which is why we're here in the first place. So before we wrap this up, I'll start in the same order I've been going, asking, do you have any final statements? So Keith, let's start with you. Do you have any final statements before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think what Anarcho was saying a moment ago was interesting. He was talking about the idea of universal values and stuff like that. That's actually a concept I've been somewhat critical of, because I've noticed that people who have this kind of universalistic outlook tend to be very, often very missionary about it. And often that translates into a more imperialistic outlook. I see that all the time. For instance, when I have discussed some of the views that I have, some of the views I'm known for with, say, people from the left, one of the first objections that's typically raised is, well, what about in your system where it's all just decentralized communities and something like that? What if somebody wants to set up a slave trading colony or a pedophile colony, or something that most people think is horrific and things like that? And I do think that's an issue. I do think that, what about people and groups that have value systems that most people would think are just completely intolerable? Like, no, we can't accept that. I think that kind of thing is not really the best model to frame a political ideology on, because it's based on the idea of worst cases. There's a saying that worst case scenarios make for a bad philosophy. But that kind of stuff does exist. There's actually an organization called the Startup Societies Foundation that I don't personally belong to and don't speak for, but they have some interesting criteria for stuff like that. And this is a group that advocates for intentional societies, but they were saying, well, what do we exclude? Well, we exclude terrorist groups. We exclude groups that act violently against other groups. We exclude groups that are associated with organized crime, things like that. So a case can be made for that kind of stuff. When it comes to actual organizations, when it comes to actual organizations that exist for a purpose, say, okay, we've got a political party or political activist group or whatever. What is the purpose of our group? Well, you do have to draw certain parameters, I think, around, well, because there are certain things that just aren't compatible with the goals that you have. But on a more global scale, I'm very influenced by a lot of past societies that have existed and how they dealt with these kinds of issues. Like I was discussing the Ottoman Turks, they had plenty of things wrong with them, in my view. But one thing I think they got right was they had their Malay system that allowed for a certain amount of autonomy for ethnic and religious minorities, which I think was one of the reasons their system lasted for as long as it did. Another one was the Holy Roman Empire, which was, as Voltaire said, it was an empire in name only. It was really just a federation of hundreds of kingdoms where everybody pretty much did their own thing. And then we know from ancient Greece, you had the cities. In the traditional Chinese culture, you had every village would have its own folk religion. You might have a totally different religion a village over from the one you had, the one that you're in. So there are plenty of historical precedents for societies that are largely localized societies that are capable of accommodating a diversity of values. There's two main reasons why I advocate this kind of stuff. One is I'm opposed to imperialist war between states, and because they kill lots of people and do terrible things. The other thing is to create institutional mechanisms where people who are being persecuted by the rest of society or by the existing state can find some degree of sovereignty or autonomy. One interesting example of that is the author Zora Neale Hurston. She was associated with the Harlem Renaissance back in the 1920s, but she was an African-American lady, but she actually grew up in a town in Florida, which was an all-black town with a black mayor, black governor, black government, black police chief, all that. This was in the height of Jim Crow and the segregation system, but it was something where you had a thriving, autonomous black community that was, economically prosperous and that kind of stuff, even within this wider society that was extremely, racist by any reasonable standards. So those are really, the reason why I favor these kinds of views. Creating safe havens for those who really are under attack by the state and opposing imperialistic aggression.
All right. What are your final thoughts, Brenton?
Yeah, I have quite a few. There's definitely some rabbit holes I'd like to jump down just based on some of the stuff that's been said here. But if I could boil down kind of what we're all talking about to its essence, to like the core themes of what people keep touching on, I think there's three big questions that we seem to have coming to the forefront. One is the question of who are our friends and allies, and how large should we draw that circle into those that we accept as part of our people, or at least as people that we are not in conflict with. That goes into the second one, tolerance, and how tolerant should we be and when should we be tolerant. And then the final thing is that when we are not tolerant, how and when should force be exercised? Like, those are the three main questions with all the labels taken off. I think that's what we're trying to puzzle out here. And I don't think that there will be necessarily a satisfying answer, but it is an important thing to go down to figure that out. Just to go on a few things, though, what I sort of wanted to mention, because Keith had said earlier about me agreeing a little bit more with SJWs. And I will say that I think a lot of the core ideas in the concept of social justice through my anarchist and Buddhist lens, I definitely tend to be sympathetic towards. I think it's a good idea to treat people with respect. I think it's a good idea to look and see if maybe the ways that we're treating folks could be done better. However, I will also say I am highly critical of a lot of aspects of activist culture. I sometimes will temper my criticism just because I know that there's a loud voice of people who are, in my opinion, overdoing it. So sometimes, even if I do have a problem with something, I may not say publicly just because I feel like I may be the discussion is too far this way, and I don't want to put like more fingers on that scale. It kind of goes back to one of the reasons why I don't usually talk against Islam. There's too many people clamoring for war with them. So yeah, I mean, I kind of want to get into that. I definitely wanted to get into, because I disagree with Anarcho on Islam like as a monolith, and we can talk about that maybe in an upcoming debate. But all in all, this feels very productive, and I'm excited to see where this goes.
Great. So Anarcho, your final words.
Yeah, I think we've said most of what we need to say. I would definitely like to see a debate on is the personal political, and also also, is there a way for different values, for communities with very different values to coexist side by side? Will is military or any kind of conflict inevitable? I think that's definitely is a good thing to get into next time. Yeah, I think honestly probably the best it would be something along the lines of our different even like different economic systems, because I think one thing you mentioned is socialist inherently authoritarianism. We could also say the same thing about capitalism. Could capitalism ever, because that's one of the critiques and libertarian socialists have of anarcho-capitalism, is that it would just prop up either, if not the state, then something very similar to the state. And I think ANCAP say the same thing about libertarian socialism. And I think that's definitely something we definitely get into. Do different economic and cultural systems require there to be some kind of authoritarian state? Brett brought up that he disagreed with my conception of Islam. That's fine. I'm not even saying that I'm like an Islamic scholar or anything, but like, do religions like Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, or Hinduism require the existence of a state? Could they exist without a state? Is anarcho-Christianity or narco-Islam a contradiction in terms? Maybe not that a debate in of itself, because you'd have to maybe find someone who's like a scholar on those particular religions, but that topic of, are there systems that necessitate a state, necessitate authoritarianism, and thus would be a contradiction in terms, to incorporate that into some sort of broader anti-authoritarian struggle. But yeah, that would be a pretty good debate in the future, and I would look forward to seeing that if it should arise.
That's great. Just one last thing I want to add is that Brenton and I, within the next week or two, are planning on having a discussion about Islam, or Christianity and Buddhism. He brought that up to me about a year ago, and we're finally going to get through on that. So yeah, stay tuned. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing on.